Kierkegaard's account of anxiety begins with a striking claim. Anxiety is not a flaw in human existence, nor a disorder to be eliminated. It is a necessary condition of freedom. Without anxiety, there would be no self, no responsibility, and no genuine choice. This claim runs directly against how anxiety is usually understood. In ordinary language, anxiety is treated as a problem, something pathological, excessive, or irrational. It is associated with fear, instability, and loss of control. Kierkegaard insists that this view mistakes the surface experience of anxiety for its deeper meaning. Anxiety, for Kierkegaard, is not fear. Fear has an object. One is afraid of something, a threat, a danger, a loss. Anxiety, by contrast, has no definite object. It arises not from something present, but from possibility itself. It is the feeling that accompanies the awareness that one could become something else, or fail to become oneself at all. This is why Kierkegaard famously describes anxiety as freedom's dizziness. Just as physical dizziness arises when one looks into a depth, anxiety arises when the self confronts the openness of its own freedom. The individual recognizes that nothing determines them completely. They see that they must choose, and that they are responsible for what they become. This recognition is unsettling. Anxiety reveals that the self is not fixed. It exposes the fact that one's life could take radically different paths. It brings into view both possibility and failure at the same time. One feels drawn toward freedom and repelled by it simultaneously. Kierkegaard insists that this tension is unavoidable. A being without freedom does not experience anxiety. An animal follows instinct. A machine follows programming. Only a being capable of choice experiences the vertigo of possibility. Anxiety, therefore, testifies to something essential about the human condition. It shows that we are not determined. At the same time, anxiety is not something we can control at will. One does not decide to feel anxious. Anxiety emerges precisely when control breaks down, when the self becomes aware that it cannot fully master itself or its future. This is why anxiety feels paradoxical. It is produced by freedom, yet experienced as a loss of control. It reveals possibility, yet feels threatening. It points toward responsibility, yet tempts the individual to flee from it. Kierkegaard believed that modern individuals misunderstood this experience. They treated anxiety as something purely negative, something to be suppressed or cured. In doing so, they attempted to eliminate the very condition that makes freedom possible. They sought comfort at the cost of selfhood. Anxiety, however, cannot simply be removed. It can be avoided temporarily through distraction, routine, or conformity. But avoidance does not eliminate anxiety. It merely pushes it out of awareness. When anxiety returns, as it inevitably does, it often returns intensified. This is because anxiety is not a malfunction. It is a disclosure. Anxiety discloses that the self stands before possibilities it must choose among. It reveals that no external authority can choose on the individual's behalf. It exposes the burden and dignity of freedom at the same time. Kierkegaard does not suggest that anxiety should be cultivated or romanticized. He insists that it should be understood. Without understanding anxiety, the individual either becomes overwhelmed by it or attempts to escape it entirely. Both responses distort the self's relation to freedom. The task is not to abolish anxiety, but to learn what it reveals about existence. Anxiety shows that the self is not complete. It stands before possibilities that are not yet actual. It must decide without guarantees. It must risk becoming itself without certainty of success. This is the dizziness of freedom, and it is the starting point of Kierkegaard's analysis. Kierkegaard deepens his account of anxiety by insisting that anxiety is not merely something we experience occasionally. It belongs to the very structure of human existence. To be a self at all is to stand in relation to possibility, and this relation inevitably produces anxiety. Possibility is the key. A being without possibility cannot feel anxiety. If everything about one's life were fixed in advance, one's actions, identity, and future, there would be no dizziness. Anxiety arises only when the individual recognizes that their life is open, that they could become something other than what they currently are. This openness is both liberating and terrifying. Anxiety reveals that nothing compels the individual absolutely. Even when circumstances constrain us, we remain free in how we respond to them. This freedom is not always welcome. It confronts the individual with responsibility, and responsibility brings uncertainty. Kierkegaard insists that anxiety is therefore ambiguous. It is not simply negative or positive. It attracts and repels at the same time. The individual is drawn toward the possibilities anxiety reveals, yet frightened by the responsibility those possibilities entail. One feels both the pull of freedom and the desire to retreat into necessity. This ambiguity explains why anxiety often feels paralyzing. When the individual becomes aware of too many possibilities at once, decision becomes difficult. One hesitates, postpones, or avoids choosing altogether. Kierkegaard believed that modern individuals were especially prone to this paralysis because modern life multiplies possibilities endlessly. Choice becomes overwhelming. Instead of committing, people hover. They wait for certainty that never arrives. They mistake postponement for wisdom and flexibility for freedom. In reality, they remain suspended, never fully becoming themselves. Anxiety plays a central role in this suspension. Rather than being confronted honestly, anxiety is often treated as a problem to be eliminated. People seek distraction, reassurance, or external direction. They look for rules, norms, or authorities that will decide for them. Kierkegaard believed this search was an attempt to escape freedom, but freedom cannot be escaped without cost. When the individual avoids anxiety by surrendering choice, they also surrender responsibility. The self becomes dependent on external structures for meaning and direction. Life becomes manageable but inwardly empty. Kierkegaard insists that anxiety must be appropriated, not avoided. To appropriate anxiety is to recognize it as a sign of freedom rather than a defect. It is to accept that anxiety accompanies genuine choice. One does not wait for anxiety to disappear before acting. One acts through anxiety. This does not mean acting recklessly, it means acting without guarantees. Kierkegaard believed that anxiety becomes destructive only when it is misunderstood. When anxiety is treated as a threat to be eliminated, it intensifies. When it is treated as a signal to be heeded, it becomes instructive. Anxiety teaches the individual about the seriousness of choice. It reveals that decisions matter, that they shape who one becomes, and that they cannot be made safely from a distance. Anxiety exposes the illusion that one can live without risk. This is why Kierkegaard insists that anxiety belongs to education in freedom. Just as physical balance requires learning to navigate dizziness, existential balance requires learning to navigate anxiety. One must learn to stand before possibility without collapsing or fleeing. This learning is difficult. It involves patience, courage, and self-honesty. The individual must resist the temptation to resolve anxiety prematurely by adopting rigid identities or absolute rules. They must remain open without becoming paralyzed. Kierkegaard believed that this balance was rare. Most people either drown in anxiety or deny it altogether. Both responses distort the self's relation to freedom. The task is to remain with anxiety long enough to choose meaningfully. Anxiety, then, is not the enemy of freedom. It is its companion, and only by understanding this companionship can the individual begin to live freely rather than merely reactively. Kierkegaard now introduces one of the most misunderstood aspects of anxiety, its relation to nothingness. Anxiety, he argues, is not anxiety about a concrete danger, but anxiety before nothing. This does not mean emptiness in a trivial sense. It means the absence of determination, the openness in which the self must choose itself. Nothingness is what makes freedom possible. If everything about a person were fixed, anxiety would have no place to arise. Anxiety appears precisely because there is a gap between what the individual is and what they might become. This gap is not filled by facts, rules, or guarantees. It is an open space that must be crossed by decision. This openness produces dizziness. The individual senses that nothing prevents them absolutely from becoming something else, or from failing to become anything at all. Anxiety arises at this edge, where the self confronts its own indeterminacy. One realizes that no external authority can finally decide on one's behalf. This is why anxiety often feels irrational. There is no object to point to. Nothing has gone wrong yet. The threat is not external. It is the recognition that one's life is not already settled. The self stands before a future that has not yet been determined. Kierkegaard believed this experience was often misinterpreted as weakness. People assume that anxiety indicates a lack of confidence, clarity, or strength. In fact, anxiety often arises precisely because the individual has become aware of their freedom. Anxiety is the price of recognizing that one must choose without certainty. This awareness can be overwhelming. Faced with nothingness, the individual may attempt to escape back into necessity. They may seek rigid identities, fixed roles, or absolute explanations. They may cling to systems, moral, social, or ideological, that promise certainty. Kierkegaard saw this as a flight from freedom. By filling the openness of possibility with necessity, the individual eliminates anxiety, but also eliminates responsibility. They trade freedom for security. The self becomes settled, but not alive. Alternatively, the individual may become fascinated by possibility itself. They linger in imagination, fantasy, and endless projection. They contemplate what they could become without ever choosing. This posture feels liberating, but it is ultimately paralyzing. The self dissolves into unrealized possibilities. Both responses avoid the task anxiety presents. Anxiety demands that the individual choose without guarantees. It does not permit certainty before commitment. It confronts the self with the fact that becoming oneself is not a theoretical problem, but a practical one. Kierkegaard insists that anxiety must be endured rather than resolved. Enduring anxiety does not mean remaining passive. It means resisting the urge to escape into either necessity or abstraction. It means staying present to the tension of possibility long enough to act responsibly. This endurance is difficult. Anxiety exposes the self's vulnerability. It reveals that one's life cannot be secured in advance. It strips away illusions of control. For this reason, anxiety is often treated as something to be eliminated rather than understood. Kierkegaard believed that modern culture specialized in this elimination. By providing constant distraction, explanation, and reassurance, it taught individuals to avoid the experience of nothingness altogether. Anxiety was pathologized, medicated, or ignored. The individual was protected from freedom at the cost of selfhood. But nothingness cannot be erased. It returns whenever the self stands before genuine choice. Anxiety reappears because freedom reasserts itself. The individual is reminded that their life is not a script to be followed, but a task to be undertaken. Anxiety, then, reveals the deepest truth of freedom. Freedom is not comfort. It is not clarity. It is not safety. It is the capacity to choose oneself in the face of nothingness. And anxiety is the feeling that accompanies that capacity. Kierkegaard now draws a crucial distinction between anxiety and fear, because confusing the two leads directly to misunderstanding both freedom and responsibility. Fear, he insists, always has an object. One fears something specific, a threat, a loss, a danger that can be named and, in principle, avoided. Anxiety has no such object. This absence is precisely what makes anxiety so difficult to tolerate. When a person is afraid, they can orient themselves toward what they fear. They can fight it, flee from it, or prepare for it. Anxiety offers no such orientation. It leaves the individual exposed to possibility without direction. This exposure is what produces dizziness. Anxiety does not point outward. It turns the individual back upon themselves. It reveals that the source of uncertainty is not the world, but the self's freedom. The individual recognizes that nothing external is forcing their hand, and that recognition is unsettling. Kierkegaard insists that this experience cannot be eliminated without distorting existence. If one attempts to treat anxiety as fear, one will seek false objects to attach it to. People invent explanations, diagnoses, or enemies in order to make anxiety manageable. They say they are anxious about something when, in truth, they are anxious about possibility itself. This misdirection has consequences. By turning anxiety into fear, the individual externalizes responsibility. They begin to believe that if the object of fear were removed, anxiety would disappear. Kierkegaard argues that this is an illusion. Anxiety will simply return in another form because its source has not been addressed. The source is freedom. This is why Kierkegaard believes anxiety is deeply educational. Anxiety teaches the individual that no amount of control over circumstances can eliminate the need for choice. Even when conditions improve, the self remains responsible for how it lives. Anxiety reveals that existence cannot be secured externally. For this reason, Kierkegaard treats anxiety as a kind of teacher. It teaches the individual about their freedom by confronting them with its consequences. Anxiety strips away excuses. It shows that one cannot hide behind necessity forever. At some point, the self must decide. This does not mean that anxiety should be welcomed or sought out. Kierkegaard is careful to avoid romanticizing anxiety. He knows it can overwhelm and destabilize. Anxiety becomes destructive when the individual lacks the courage or support to endure it. But eliminating anxiety entirely is not a solution. It removes the very condition through which freedom becomes conscious. The task, then, is to learn how to relate to anxiety properly. This proper relation does not involve suppression or indulgence. It involves recognition. One must recognize anxiety for what it is, not a sign of danger, but a sign of freedom. This recognition changes how anxiety is experienced. Anxiety still feels uncomfortable, but it no longer feels meaningless. Kierkegaard insists that anxiety becomes destructive only when the individual refuses to learn from it. When anxiety is misunderstood, it leads either to paralysis or to rigid self-definition. The individual either freezes before possibility or clings to fixed identities to escape it. Both responses diminish the self. By contrast, when anxiety is understood as freedom's dizziness, it becomes a guide rather than an enemy. It signals that a genuine choice is at hand. It indicates that the individual stands before a moment that matters. Kierkegaard believed that many people never reach this understanding. They spend their lives trying to eliminate anxiety, mistaking comfort for freedom. They avoid the dizziness of possibility by surrendering responsibility. Their lives become predictable, manageable, and inwardly empty. Anxiety remains the price of refusing this emptiness. It insists that the self cannot be reduced to routine or role. It reminds the individual that they are more than what has already been determined. In this sense, anxiety protects the self from becoming merely functional. Kierkegaard believed that only by passing through anxiety can the individual learn to choose freely, not recklessly, not arbitrarily, but responsibly. Anxiety does not tell the individual what to choose. It tells them that they must choose, and that demand, once recognized, cannot be undone. Kierkegaard brings his account of anxiety to a decisive conclusion by insisting that anxiety is not something to be eliminated, but something that must be passed through. Anxiety belongs to the process by which the self becomes capable of genuine freedom. Without anxiety, freedom would remain abstract and unreal. This is why Kierkegaard treats anxiety as preparatory. Anxiety prepares the individual for responsibility. It confronts them with the fact that no external structure can finally decide on their behalf. Laws, traditions, roles, and explanations can guide, but they cannot remove the need for choice. Anxiety arises at the point where guidance ends and responsibility begins. Kierkegaard insists that the individual must learn to endure anxiety. Endurance does not mean resignation. It means remaining present to the experience without fleeing into necessity or dissolving into possibility. The individual must resist the urge to resolve anxiety prematurely by clinging to rigid identities or surrendering to distraction. This endurance transforms anxiety. When anxiety is endured rather than avoided, it loses its paralyzing power. It no longer overwhelms the self. Instead, it sharpens awareness. The individual becomes attentive to what is at stake in their choices. Freedom becomes concrete rather than theoretical. Kierkegaard believed that anxiety educates freedom by teaching the individual the seriousness of becoming oneself. It reveals that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the capacity to commit oneself honestly in the face of uncertainty. Anxiety strips away illusions of safety. It shows that one cannot live without risk and still live authentically. This insight changes how one relates to life. Instead of waiting for certainty, the individual learns to act responsibly without it. Instead of demanding guarantees, they accept the risk inherent in choice. Anxiety becomes a companion rather than an enemy, a sign that one is standing before something that matters. Kierkegaard is careful to emphasize that this does not eliminate suffering. Freedom remains difficult. Responsibility remains heavy. Anxiety does not disappear once it has done its work. It returns whenever the self confronts new possibilities, but its meaning changes. It no longer signifies failure. It signifies seriousness. Kierkegaard believed that modern culture attempted to bypass this education. By promising comfort, security, and control, it encouraged individuals to avoid anxiety rather than learn from it. People were taught to minimize risk and maximize stability. As a result, freedom was reduced to choice within safe boundaries, and anxiety was treated as pathology. Kierkegaard regarded this as a profound loss. A life without anxiety may be comfortable, but it is also shallow. It lacks the depth that comes from standing before real possibility. It avoids the task of becoming oneself in any serious sense. Anxiety, by contrast, refuses to let the self settle prematurely. It insists that the individual remains open to becoming. It resists closure. It prevents identity from hardening into mere habit. In this way, anxiety protects freedom from being reduced to routine. Kierkegaard believed that only by passing through anxiety could the individual become capable of authentic commitment. Commitment that has never been tested by anxiety remains fragile. It depends on favorable conditions. Commitment forged in anxiety is different. It has been chosen without certainty and therefore belongs genuinely to the individual. This is why anxiety stands at the threshold of faith, ethics, and selfhood. Before one can commit, one must confront possibility. Before one can choose oneself, one must feel the dizziness of freedom. Anxiety is the experience of that threshold. To flee anxiety is to flee freedom. To endure anxiety is to allow freedom to become real. Kierkegaard's account does not promise comfort. It promises seriousness. And for Kierkegaard, seriousness, not happiness, not security, not success, is the mark of a life lived truthfully.